At 4 in the morning, on the 16th of August, 2025, a silence that usually guarded the borderlands of Burkina Faso was broken by the rumble of 57 trucks. They did not carry grain for the hungry. They did not bring blankets for the displaced. Beneath sacks of false cargo lay enough rifles, rockets, and grenades to drown a nation in fire. It was not just smuggling, it was preparation for war. Who sent them? Who financed them? Who thought Africa could still be broken by shadows moving at night? The answer came swiftly. President Ibrahim Traoré did not hesitate. Like a sentinel awakened, he summoned his commanders, blocked the road, and revealed the truth that had been hidden in steel and blood. This was not simply an arms seizure. It was a revelation that foreign powers still write secret plans for African soil. But this time, Africa was not asleep. Stay with us, because this isn't just breaking news. It's the echo of our ancestors' prayers. Subscribe and walk with us for an Africa that refuses to bow again. The night was heavy, thick with the kind of silence that usually blankets the Sahel before dawn. Along the Canary border, Captain Musa Kabore and his small patrol unit noticed what should never have been there, a long convoy moving slowly under the cover of darkness. 57 trucks, engines humming low, headlights dimmed as if secrecy itself were their cargo. Aid shipments, some whispered. But who delivers aid at midnight? Through back roads? Without papers or escorts? Caboret's instinct screamed danger. He reached for the radio and sent the message that would change the course of his nation. The signal reached Ouagadougou, where President Ibrahim Traoré, awake and alert, he listened without hesitation. His voice was firm, measured, almost prophetic. Block that road. Intercept the convoy. But be careful, this is no ordinary smuggling. Within hours, drones circled overhead, tracking the slow crawl of the trucks. Special forces under General Ibrahim Zerbo positioned themselves like hunters waiting for prey. The ambush was swift. At precisely 4 o'clock, barricades slammed down across the road. The drivers panicked, some trying to turn, others abandoning their seats. Within minutes, the convoy was captured. Then came the moment of revelation. Soldiers ripped open the tarps covering the first truck. What they found beneath made seasoned men stagger backward, stacked like hidden coffins. AK-47 rifles, M16 second, rocket launchers, crates of hand grenades. Truck after truck revealed the same truth. This was not food. This was not medicine. This was an arsenal, a mobile war machine rolling silently into Burkina Faso. Captain Kabore's voice trembled as he reported back, "Mr. President, you won't believe this. These trucks carry enough weapons to equip an entire army." President Traore's reply was, "Cold steel, secure everything. Do not lose a single bullet. Make those drivers talk. Someone is preparing for war against us." The soldiers stood in stunned silence. In the pale light of dawn, weapons gleamed like teeth ready to bite. The air felt heavy with betrayal. Who would dare unleash this on their land? The magnitude was overwhelming. 25,000 rifles, 13 million rounds of ammunition, 70,000 grenades, 2,000 rocket launchers. Each crate whispered the same prophecy: someone intended to burn the Sahel to ashes. Yet in that moment of fear, something else rose, a defiance. For this was the hour when leadership mattered, when hesitation would mean destruction. Traoré did not tremble. He moved with clarity, commanding his people to lock down the borders, seize every weapon, and begin the hunt for truth. This was the beginning of a new chapter, not only for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa. What started as a midnight convoy had become the spark that revealed a far deeper conspiracy, one that stretched beyond deserts and seas, into the hands of those who still believed Africa must kneel. The night of August 16th was no accident. It was the unveiling of a war planned in silence, but stopped by vigilance. The question that burned in every heart that dawn was the same: if these weapons had reached their destination, what future would have awaited the children of Burkina Faso? By sunrise, the captured convoy stretched like a scar across the border road. Soldiers stood guard, Their eyes scanning crates stacked higher than their own bodies, the inventory began. Numbers spilled like confessions: 25,000 AK-47 rifles, 10,000 M16 second, 70,000 grenades, 13 million rounds of ammunition, 400 anti-aircraft missiles, and 50 tons of explosives. Even the most seasoned generals had never seen such a cache outside of full-scale war. General Serbo, hardened by years of combat, muttered under his breath, "This is not smuggling. This is an invasion in waiting." Interior Minister Hussein Traoré added grimly, "If these weapons had reached their hands, Burkina Faso would already be burning." The question haunted everyone whose hands. Investigators moved quickly. Each driver was isolated, questioned under floodlights that burned through their lies. One man, Marc Antoine Zongo, broke first. His voice shook as he revealed, "We were told these were agricultural machine parts. Deliver them to a warehouse in Togo." Nothing more. His eyes betrayed terror, not of the soldiers before him, but of the unseen powers behind the operation. Patterns began to surface. Each truck had left from a different town. They had traveled on different schedules, only joining together just before reaching the border. It was a choreography of deception, designed to confuse patrols and avoid suspicion. Whoever planned this had studied every weakness in the system. Then came the serial numbers. Many were filed off, but forensic teams with ultraviolet scanners recovered enough. The trail stretched across continents, some rifles traced back to Libya, the relics of a war that tore a nation apart. Others bore the mark of Yemen, a country bled by endless conflict. Still others brand new, factory fresh, never fired, NATO made, stamped with dates that revealed they had left European warehouses only months before. The value of the cash staggered the mind: $700 million, a fortune large enough to finance a coup, fund militias for years, or topple governments across the Sahel crossroads. President Ibrahim Traoré gathered his ministers in an emergency council. Documents, photographs, and weapons lay spread across the table like evidence before a jury. Defense Minister General Sadu, a man not easily shaken, leaned back in disbelief. "With this arsenal," he said, "you could not only destabilize Burkina Faso, you could invade a country." The room fell silent. No one spoke. The weight of the revelation pressed down like an iron hand. Then President Traoré broke the silence. His tone was steady, his words deliberate. "This is no accident. This is not crime for profit. This is strategy, a plan to carve Africa into pieces, as they did in Libya, Syria, and Yemen. But this time, they chose the wrong land. We are not asleep." Investigators doubled their efforts. Hidden among ledgers and digital files recovered from seized laptops, they uncovered payment records, shadowy transfers routed through Gulf banks, then laundered in European accounts. The fingerprints of foreign power began to emerge. The deeper they looked, the more clear the picture became. This was not the work of petty smugglers. This was orchestration at the highest level. As the evidence mounted, the question sharpened: who could command such resources? Who had the audacity to flood Africa with fire? And who believed that Burkina Faso would crumble under the weight of 1,000 guns? What had begun as a border interception had now become the opening act of a geopolitical drama. For the first time in years, Africa was staring directly into the face of a global plot and refusing to look away. This was no longer just an arms seizure. It was a mirror, reflecting the reality that Africa's enemies were still writing scripts of destruction. But now, under President Ibrahim Traoré, the pages were being torn apart before they could be acted out. And as the investigation pushed forward, one truth was certain: the weapons were not the real story. The real story was the hands that paid for them. By the second day, the investigation tore deeper than anyone expected. What seemed at first like an isolated smuggling attempt unfolded into a conspiracy with tentacles stretching across continents. The turning point came with the arrest of Francois Bongo, a wealthy businessman whose name carried weight in Ouagadougou's elite circles. For hours, he denied everything. But when confronted with documents, recordings, and the scale of evidence, his mask broke, his voice faltered, his eyes filled with fear. And finally, he spoke. This wasn't just about weapons. The plan was set months ago. We had help. Foreign powers promised us their support. The goal was clear: overthrow President Ibrahim Traoré and install a pro-Western puppet. The room froze. Ministers exchanged glances. Intelligence officers scribbled notes. President Traoré leaned forward and asked the question that thundered across history. Which foreign powers? Bongo hesitated, then dropped the names like bombs. The meetings were in Accra. Delegates came from Abidjan, the instructions from Paris, and the green light, Washington. The revelation hit like an earthquake. Operation Restored Democracy. He explained, had a budget of $700 million. The convoy of 57 trucks was only phase one. Terrorist attacks were to be staged in major towns. Chaos would spread. Opposition groups, already promised funding, would mobilize. Traitors within the army were primed to defect, and in the smoke of violence, a coup would rise. Welcomed by Western diplomats under the banner of restoring democracy, the audacity was staggering. They had written scripts for civil war as if nations were theater stages. They had prepared lists of new ministers, even drafted their first decrees. Before a single bullet had been fired, the arrests multiplied. Warehouses raided in Ouagadougou revealed stashes of weapons, cash reserves, and forged documents. Among the detained were former ministers who once shook hands with the people, retired generals who had sworn oaths to defend the nation, businessmen who once smiled at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and even foreign nationals carrying diplomatic passports that proved false. Their common thread: open opposition to President Traoré's vision of African sovereignty. In his private chambers, the president read the confessions with a calm fury. His aides say he whispered only one line, echoing the spirit of Sankara: they think Africa is still asleep. But Africa was no longer asleep. The evidence was overwhelming: financial transfers, coded messages, satellite phone calls intercepted in the Sahel Crossroads. Each pointed not just to domestic betrayal but to international orchestration. It was clear. This was no accident. This was recolonization wearing the mask of democracy. As the details emerged, the betrayal cut deep. To learn that fellow Africans had conspired with foreign hands to burn their own soil felt like a wound on the nation's soul. Yet President Traoré transformed that wound into a weapon of truth. He vowed transparency. The world would see, the people would judge. This was not only about 57 trucks, it was about centuries of manipulation condensed into a single night. And in stopping it, Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré had not only saved his own country, but ignited a question that echoed across the continent. When the revelations could no longer be contained in quiet chambers, President Ibrahim Traoré chose the battlefield of truth. On the morning of the 18th of August, he summoned the press, not in secret, not in whispers, but in full daylight. Cameras from CNN, the BBC, Al Jazeera, and Africa News filled the hall. Behind him rose a mountain of seized weapons, rifles stacked like bones, rocket launchers towering like silent witnesses. It was not a press conference, it was a trial. And the world was the jury. He began simply, "My fellow Burkinabe," and to the international community. 3 days ago, we intercepted the largest weapons smuggling operation in our nation's history. But this was more than smuggling. This was an attempt to destroy us from within. His words struck with the rhythm of a hammer. He held up documents, pages marked with coded instructions, bank transfers, and names that once sat in parliaments. This is the proof. It declared, 57 trucks, $700 million of weapons, destined not for defense but for division. The goal: to plunge our people into chaos, to install a government that answers to Paris and Washington, not to Ouagadougou. Questions flew from journalists like arrows. CNN asked, which countries are behind this? Traore's response was sharp. Some of these weapons were manufactured in NATO countries. The investigation is ongoing. But the masks are falling. BBC asked, who are the masterminds? The president's voice carried the weight of a generation. 17 individuals are under arrest. Ministers, generals, informants. The full truth will soon be known. Then came the moment that silenced the hall. He played a video of Francois Bongo's confession. The businessman appeared on the screen, trembling, weeping. They lied to us. They said we were bringing democracy, but we would have destroyed our own country. President Ibrahim Traoré was right. I betrayed my people. I am sorry. The hall fell into stunned silence. In that silence, Africa heard itself. It was the sound of betrayal unmasked and of sovereignty rising. The backlash was immediate. Western capitals demanded the release of the foreign nationals caught with false diplomatic passports. Threats of sanctions rattled across the airwaves, but President Traoré stood firm. Having a diplomatic passport does not give you the right to commit crimes on African soil. Other voices rose in contrast. Russia declared, Burkina Faso has the right to defend itself. China offered equipment to strengthen border defenses. Turkey called arms smuggling a crime against humanity. Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro went further, hailing Traoré as today's Simón Bolívar. Across Africa, leaders from Mali, Niger, and Guinea echoed solidarity, recognizing that this was not just an attack on one nation, but on the entire Sahel crossroads. In the courtroom, the accused sat broken, surrounded by stacks of evidence, wire transfers, intercepted calls, surveillance footage. Some begged for mercy, others bowed their heads in shame. But the people demanded justice, chanting outside the courthouse, no more puppets, no more chains through it all. President Ibrahim Traoré's message grew louder. Clearer, we are the grandchildren of Thomas Sankara. We will not kneel, not to weapons, not to bribes, not to threats. His speeches, fiery yet measured, began to spread beyond borders. Across the diaspora, elders in Harlem, Brixton, Kingston, and Bahia listened and whispered the same thought. A new Sankara walks among us. This was not merely a leader defending his nation. This was a man confronting an empire of shadows with nothing but the light of truth and the will of his people. And in that confrontation, Africa saw something it had not seen in decades: the possibility of dignity without permission, freedom without apology. The question now hung heavy in the air, reaching every elder, every youth, every exile who watched from afar. Could this moment be the rebirth of Pan-Africanism, the prophecy that our ancestors carried in their prayers? By the week's end, the story had transformed from fear into defiance, from interception into resurrection. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a sea of people in Independence Square. Tens of thousands had gathered, women in bright cloths, elders leaning on canes, young men with fists raised, children hoisted on their fathers' shoulders. Behind the podium, towering piles of rifles, rocket launchers, and crates of ammunition formed a grim backdrop. What was meant to enslave now stood as evidence of liberation. The president's voice rang out over the crowd. A week ago, they tried to break us. They sent 57 trucks of death. But today, those weapons belong not to the agents of chaos, but to the people of Burkina Faso. And hear me clearly, we will not use them to divide. We will melt them down. We will build schools. We will build hospitals. We will dig canals to water our fields. Tools of death will become projects of life. A roar thundered through the square. Women ululated. Men clapped until their hands stung. Elders wept openly. Then, in front of the nation and the watching world, a giant cauldron was wheeled onto the stage. Soldiers lifted the first rifle, once designed to spill blood, and dropped it into the fire. The crowd gasped as metal melted, glowing red, then poured into a mold. This Traoré declared. Holding up the cast will be the first school bell, and when it rings, our children will not hear war, they will hear peace. The symbolism was electric. Across Africa, news outlets replayed the scene. Commentators called it unprecedented, not just seizing weapons, but transforming them into instruments of hope. A representative of the United Nations admitted, "We have never seen such a literal transformation of war into peace." The African Union's envoy added, "This is more than disarmament, this is a rebirth." But it was more than diplomacy, it was prophecy fulfilled. For decades, Africa had been told that its destiny was to receive, not to create, to obey, not to decide. Now, in the heart of the Sahel crossroads, President Ibrahim Traoré had inverted the script from rifles to bells, from grenades to irrigation pipes. He showed the continent what Pan-Africanism looked like when written not in manifestos but in molten metal. The plan was bold. 1,000 kilometers of canals would be carved from the funds raised by selling scrap metal. 50 new health clinics would rise in villages where children had never seen a doctor. 100 schools would be built so that no child would ever again sit under a tree without a desk. As the president spoke, his words turned into promises, his promises into action, and his action into legacy. Internationally, the ripple spread. While Western powers seethed at the loss of their plan, elders across the diaspora smiled. In Harlem, a grandmother whispered to her grandson, "This is what Sankara dreamed." In Kingston, old men at a rum shop raised their glasses, "Africa can do it." In Paris, exiled Africans wiped tears, murmuring, "It's time for Africa." Critics called it spectacle, supporters called it sovereignty, but to the people of Burkina Faso, it was survival with dignity. As one old man cried while watching rifles burn, "They were going to kill our grandchildren with these. Now those same weapons will give them classrooms." The symbolism went beyond Burkina Faso. In Mali, in Niger, in Guinea, leaders studied the model. Could weapons seized from smugglers be melted into bridges and houses? Could Pan-Africanism be forged? Literally. From the steel once pointed at African chests, this was more than national defense. It was a declaration to the world. African sovereignty is not theory, it is practice. It is transformation. And so the people left Independence Square, not with fear, but with pride. They carried home the image of fire turned into light, of weapons turned into bells, of a nation turning a plot of death into a foundation of life. The final question echoed across every street, every village, every diaspora church and gathering. If Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré can turn 57 trucks of war into the sound of school bells, what else can Africa transform when it finally decides to rise? In the end, it was not just the seizure of 57 trucks, it was the seizing of a future once scripted by others. And the rewriting of that story with African hands, what began as an ambush on a midnight convoy became a moment of revelation that the battle for Africa is not only fought with weapons, but with will, with vision, and with unity. President Ibrahim Traoré did not merely stop an arms shipment, he stopped a coup, a conspiracy, a recolonization dressed in the language of restored democracy. He stood before the world, unafraid, declaring that Africa will no longer bow. His voice echoed with the fire of Thomas Sankara, with the faith of generations who prayed for a day when Africa could defend itself and decide for itself. And when the rifles melted into bells, when the grenades were promised to become canals, when rockets became the iron for hospital beds, a new chapter opened. It was not only about Burkina Faso and Ibrahim Traoré, it was about Pan-Africanism reborn. About African sovereignty proclaimed, not in theory, but in steel and fire. This was more than Africa news. This was a prophecy fulfilled at the Sahel crossroads. The world now asks, what comes next? Will other nations dare to follow? Will the diaspora believe again in a continent rising? And will our children remember that on this day, Africa refused to kneel. If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak. Subscribe because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear. New Africa. Africa rise. It's time for Africa.